Section 20 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829, the story of the loves of Qumir al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badara, Princess of China, Part 1. About 20 days' sail from the coast of Persia, there are islands in the main ocean called the Islands of the Children of Khaledan. These islands are divided into 4 great provinces, which have all of them very flourishing and populous cities, forming together a powerful kingdom. It was formerly governed by a king named Shah Zaman, who had 4 lawful wives, all daughters of kings, and 60 concubines. Shah Zaman thought himself the most happy monarch of the world on account of his peaceful and prosperous reign. One thing only disturbed his happiness, which was that he was advanced in years and had no children, though he had so many wives. He knew not to what to attribute this barrenness, and what increased his affliction was that he was likely to leave his kingdom without a successor. He dissembled his discontent, and this dissimulation only heightened his uneasiness. At length he broke silence, and one day after he had complained bitterly of his misfortune to his Grand Vizier, he asked him if he knew any remedy for it. That wise minister replied, "If what your Majesty requires of me had depended on the ordinary rules of human wisdom, you had soon had an answer to your satisfaction, but my experience and knowledge fall far short of your question. It is to God only that we can apply in cases of this kind. In the midst of our prosperities, which often tempt us to forget him, he is pleased to mortify us in some instance, that we may address our thoughts to him, acknowledge his omnipotence, and ask of him what we ought to expect from him alone. Your Majesty has subjects," proceeded he, "who make a profession of honoring and serving God, and suffering great hardships for his sake. To them I would advise you to have recourse, and engage them by alms to join their prayers with yours. Perhaps someone among them may be so pure and pleasing to God as to obtain a hearing for your prayers." Shah Zaman approved this advice and thanked his vizier. He immediately caused alms to be given to every community of these holy men in his dominions, and having sent for the superiors, declared to them his intention, and desired them to acquaint their devout men with it. The king obtained of heaven what he requested, for in 9 months' time he had a son by one of his wives. To express his gratitude to heaven, he sent fresh alms to the communities of devotees, and the prince's birthday was celebrated not only in his capital, but throughout his dominions for a whole week. The prince was brought to him as soon as born, and he found him so beautiful that he gave him the name of Qumir al-Zaman, or Moon of the Age. He was brought up with all imaginable care, and when he had arrived at a proper age, his father appointed him an experienced governor and able preceptors. These persons, distinguished by their capacity, found in him a ready wit, capable of receiving all the instructions that were proper to be given him, as well as in relation to morals as other knowledge which a prince ought to possess. As he grew up, he learned all his exercises, and acquitted himself with such grace and wonderful address as to charm all that saw him, and particularly the Sultan his father. When he had attained the age of 15, the Sultan, who tenderly loved him and gave him every day new marks of his affection, proposed to afford a still higher demonstration by resigning his throne to him, and he accordingly acquainted his Grand Vizier with his intentions. "I fear," said he, "lest my son should lose, in the inactivity of youth, those advantages which nature and my education have given him. Therefore, since I am advanced in age and ought to think of retirement, I propose to resign the government to him and pass the remainder of my days in the satisfaction of seeing him reign. I have borne the fatigue of a crown till I am weary of it, and think it is now proper for me to retire." The Grand Vizier declined offering all the reasons he could have alleged to dissuade the Sultan from such a proceeding. On the contrary, he appeared to acquiesce with him in his opinion. "Sir," replied he, "the Prince is yet but young, and it would not, in my humble opinion, be advisable to burden him with the weight of a crown so soon. Your Majesty fears, with great reason, his youth may be corrupted by indolence, but to avoid this danger, do not you think it would be proper to marry him? Marriage forms attachment and prevents dissipation. Your Majesty might then admit him of your council, where he would learn by degrees the art of reigning, and so be prepared to receive your authority whenever, by your own experience, you shall think him qualified." Shah Zuman approved the advice of his prime minister and summoned the prince to appear before him at the same time that he dismissed the Grand Vizier. The prince, who had been accustomed to see his father only at certain times without being sent for, was a little startled at this summons. When therefore he came into his presence, he saluted him with great respect and stood with his eyes fixed on the ground. The Sultan, perceiving his constraint, addressed him with great mildness. "Do you know, son, for what reason I have sent for you?" The prince modestly replied, "God alone knows the heart. I shall hear it from your Majesty with pleasure." "I sent for you," resumed the Sultan, "to inform you that it is my intention to provide a proper marriage for you. What do you think of my design?" The prince heard this with great uneasiness. He was greatly agitated, and knew not what answer to make. After a few moments' silence, he replied, "Sir, I beseech you to pardon me if I seem surprised at the declaration you have made. I did not expect such proposals at my present age. I know not whether I could prevail on myself to marry, on account of the trouble incident to a married life, and the many treacheries of women which I have read of. I may not be always of the same mind, yet I conceive it will require time to determine on what your Majesty requires of me." The prince's answer extremely afflicted his father. He was not a little grieved to discover his aversion to marriage, yet would not charge him with disobedience, nor exert his paternal authority. He contented himself with telling him he would not force his inclinations, but give him time to consider of the proposal, and reflect that a prince destined to govern a great kingdom ought to take some care to leave a successor, and that in giving himself that satisfaction he communicated it to his father, who would be glad to see himself provide in his son and his issue. Shah Zuman said no more to the prince, but admitted him into his council and gave him every reason to be satisfied. At the end of the year he took him aside and said to him, "My son, have you thoroughly considered what I proposed to you last year about marrying? Will you still refuse me that pleasure I expect from your obedience, and suffer me to die without affording me that satisfaction?" The prince seemed less disconcerted than before, and was not long answering his father to this effect: "Sir, I have not neglected to consider of your proposal, but after the maturest reflection find myself more confirmed in my resolution to continue in a state of celibacy. The infinite mischief which women have caused in the world, and which are on record in our histories, and the accounts I daily hear to their disadvantage, are the motives which powerfully influence me against having anything to do with them, so that I hope your Majesty will pardon me if I presume to tell you it will be in vain to solicit me any further upon this subject." As soon as he had thus spoken, he quitted the Sultan abruptly, without waiting his answer. Any monarch but Shah Zuman would have been angry at such freedom in a son, and would have made him repent. But he loved him, and preferred gentle methods before he proceeded to compulsion. He communicated this new cause of discontent to his prime minister. "I have followed your advice," said he, "but Kumir al-Zaman is farther than ever from complying with my desires." He delivered his determination in such free terms that it required all my reason and moderation to keep my temper. Fathers who so earnestly desire children as I did this son are fools, who seek to deprive themselves of that rest which it is in their own power to enjoy without control. Tell me, I beseech you, how I shall reclaim a disposition so rebellious to my will. Sir, answered the Grand Vizier, patience brings many things about that before seemed impracticable, but it may be this affair is of a nature not likely to succeed that way. Your Majesty will have no cause to reproach yourself for precipitation, if you would give the Prince another year to consider your proposal. If in this interval he return to his duty, you will have the greater satisfaction, as you will have employed only paternal love to induce him, and if he still continue averse, when this is expired, your Majesty may in full council observe that it is highly necessary for the good of the state that he should marry, and it is not likely he will refuse to comply before so grave an assembly, which you honour with your presence. The Sultan, who so anxiously desired to see his son married, thought this long delay an age. However, though with much difficulty, he yielded to his Grand Vizier's reasons, which he could not disapprove. After the Grand Vizier was gone, the Sultan went to the apartment of the mother of Prince Kumir al-Zaman, to whom he had often expressed his desire to see the prince married. When he had told her, with much concern, how his son had a second time refused to comply with his wishes, and the indulgence which, by the advice of his Grand Vizier, he was inclined to show him, he said, I know he has more confidence in you than he has in me, and will be more likely to attend to your advice. I therefore desire you would take an opportunity to talk to him seriously, and urge upon him that if he persists in his obstinacy, he will oblige me to have recourse to measures which would be disagreeable to me, and which would give him cause to repent having disobeyed me. Fatima, for so was the lady called, told the prince, the first time she saw him, that she had been informed of his second refusal to marry, and how much chagrin his resolution had occasioned his father. Madam, replied the prince, I beseech you not to renew my grief upon that head. I fear, under my present uneasiness, something may escape me, which may not be consistent with the respect I owe you. Fatima judged from this answer that this was not a proper time to speak to him, and therefore deferred what she had to say to another opportunity. Some considerable time after, Fatima thought she had found a more favourable season, which gave her hopes of being heard upon that subject. Son, said she, I beg of you, if it be not disagreeable, to tell me what reason you have for your great aversion to marriage. If it be the wickedness of some women, nothing can be more unreasonable and weak. I will not undertake the defence of those that are bad. There are a great number of them undoubtedly, but it would be the height of injustice on their account to condemn all the sex. Alas, my son, you have in your books read of many bad women who have occasioned great mischief, and I will not excuse them, but you do not consider how many monarchs, sultans, and other princes there have been in the world, whose tyrannies, barbarities, and cruelties astonish those that read of them as well as myself. Now for one wicked woman you will meet with 1,000 tyrants and barbarians, and what torment do you think must a good woman undergo who is matched with any of these wretches? Madam, replied the prince, I doubt not there are a great number of wise, virtuous, good, affable, and well-behaved women in the world. Would to God they all resembled you. But what deters me is the hazardous choice a man is obliged to make, and oftentimes one has not the liberty of following his inclination. Let us suppose then, madam, continued he, that I had a mind to marry, as the Sultan my father so earnestly desires. What wife, think you, would he be likely to provide for me? Probably a princess, whom he would demand of some neighbouring prince, and who would think it an honour done him to send her. Handsome or ugly, she must be taken. Nay, suppose no other princess excelled her in beauty, who can be certain that her temper would be good, that she would be affable, complacent, easy, obliging, and the like, that her conversation would generally turn on solid subjects and not on dress, fashions, ornaments, and 1,000 such fooleries which would disgust any man of sense. In a word, that she would not be haughty, proud, arrogant, impertinent, scornful, and waste an estate in frivolous expenses such as gay clothes, jewels, toys, and foolish, mistaken magnificence. You see, madam, continued he, by one single article, how many reasons a man may have to be disgusted at marriage. Let this princess be ever so perfect, accomplished, and irreproachable in her conduct, I've yet a great many more reasons not to alter my opinion and resolution. What, son? Exclaimed Fatima. Have you then more reasons after those you have already alleged? I do not doubt of being able to answer them and stop your mouth with a word. You may proceed, madam, returned the prince, and perhaps I may find a reply to your answer. I mean, son, said Fatima, that it is easy for a prince who has had the misfortune to marry such a wife as you describe to get rid of her and take care that she may not ruin the state. Ah, madam, replied the prince, but you do not consider what a mortification it would be to a person of my quality to be obliged to come to such an extremity. Would it not have been more for his honour and quiet that he had never run such a risk? But, son, said Fatima once more, as you take the case, I apprehend you have a mind to be the last king of your race, who have reigned so long and gloriously over the isles of the children of Khaledan. Madam, replied the prince, for myself I do not desire to survive the king my father, and if I should die before him, it would be no great matter of wonder, since so many children have died before their parents. But it is always glorious to a race of kings that it should end with a prince worthy to be so, as I should endeavour to make myself, like my predecessors, and like the first of our race. From that time Fatima had frequent conferences with her son the prince on the same subject, and she omitted no opportunity or argument to endeavour to root out his aversion to the fair sex. But he eluded all her reasonings by such arguments as she could not well answer, and continued unaltered. The year expired, and to the great regret of the Sultan, Prince Kumir al-Zaman gave not the least proof of having changed his sentiments. One day, therefore, when there was a great council held, the prime vizier, the other viziers, the principal officers of the crown, and the generals of the army being present, the Sultan thus addressed the prince. My son, it is now a long while since I expressed to you my earnest desire to see you married, and I imagined you would have had more complaisance for a father who required nothing unreasonable of you than to oppose him so long. But after such a resistance on your part, which has almost worn out my patience, I thought fit to propose the same thing once more to you in the presence of my council. It is not merely to oblige a parent that you ought to have acceded to my wish. The well-being of my dominions requires your compliance, and this assembly join with me in expecting it. Declare yourself, then, that your answer may regulate my proceedings. The prince answered with so little reserve, or rather with so much warmth, that the Sultan, enraged to see himself thwarted by him in full council, exclaimed, How, unnatural son, have you the insolence to talk thus to your father and Sultan? He ordered the guards to take him away and carry him to an old tower that had been long unoccupied, where he was shut up with only a bed, a little furniture, some books, and one slave to attend him. Kumir al-Zaman, thus deprived of liberty, was nevertheless pleased that he had the freedom to converse with his books, which made him regard his confinement with indifference. In the evening he bathed and said his prayers, and after having read some chapters in the Koran, with the same tranquillity of mind as if he had been in the Sultan's palace, he undressed himself and went to bed, leaving his lamp burning by him while he slept. End of Section 20. Section 21 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Kumir al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badura, Princess of China, Part 2. In this tower was a well, which served in the daytime for a retreat to a certain fairy named Mamun, daughter of Damirat, king or head of a legion of genies. It was about midnight when Mamun sprung lightly to the mouth of the well, to wander about the world after her wonted custom, where her curiosity led her. She was surprised to see a light in the prince's chamber. She entered, and without stopping at the slave who lay at the door, approached the bed. The prince had but half covered his face with the bedclothes, which Maimoune lifted up and perceived the finest young man she had ever seen in her rambles through the world. What beauty, or rather what prodigy of beauty, said she within herself, must this youth appear, when the eyes, concealed by such well-formed eyelids, shall be opened? What crime can he have committed that a man of his high rank can deserve to be treated thus rigorously? For she had already heard his story, and could hardly believe it. She could not forbear admiring the prince, till at length, having kissed him gently on both cheeks and in the middle of the forehead without waking him, she laid the bedclothes in the order they were in before, and took her flight into the air. As she was ascending into the middle region, she heard a great flapping of wings, towards which she directed her course, and when she approached, she knew it was a genie who made the noise, but it was one of those that are rebellious against God. As for Maimoune, she belonged to that class whom the great Solomon had compelled to acknowledge him. This genie, whose name was Danhash, and son of Shamhurash, knew Maimoune and was seized with fear, being sensible how much power she had over him by her submission to the Almighty. He would fain have avoided her, but she was so near him, he must either fight or yield. He therefore broke silence first. "Brave Maimoune," said he, in the tone of a suppliant, "swear to me in the name of the great God that you will not hurt me, and I swear also on my part not to do you any harm." "Cursed genie," replied Maimoune, "what hurt canst thou do me? I fear thee not, but I will grant thee this favour. I will swear not to do thee any harm. Tell me then, wandering spirit, whence thou comest, what thou hast seen, and what thou hast done this night." "Fair lady," answered Danhash, "you meet me in a good time to hear something very wonderful." Danhash, the genie, rebellious against God, proceeded and said to Maimoune, "Since you desire, I will inform you that I have come from the utmost limits of China, which comprise the remotest islands of this hemisphere." "But charming Maimoune," said Danhash, who trembled with fear at the sight of this fairy, so that he could hardly speak, "promise me at least you will forgive me, and let me proceed after I have satisfied your request." "Go on, cursed spirit," replied Maimoune. "Go on and fear nothing. Dost thou think I am as perfidious as thyself, and capable of breaking the solemn oath I have made? Be sure you relate nothing but what is true, or I shall clip thy wings and treat thee as thou deserves." Danhash, a little encouraged by the words of Maimoune, said, "My dear lady, I will tell you nothing but what is strictly true, if you will but have the goodness to hear me. The country of China, from whence I come, is one of the largest and most powerful kingdoms of the earth, on which depend the remotest islands of this hemisphere, as I have already told you. The king of this country is at present Dower, who has an only daughter, the finest woman that ever was seen in the world since it has been a world. Neither you nor I, neither your class nor mine, nor all our respective genies, have expressions forcible enough, nor eloquence sufficient to convey an adequate description of her charms. Her hair is brown, and of such length as to trail on the ground, and so thick that when she has fastened it in buckles on her head, it may be fitly compared to one of those fine clusters of grapes, whose fruit is so very large. Her forehead is as smooth as the best polished mirror, and admirably formed. Her eyes are black, sparkling, and full of fire. Her nose is neither too long nor too short, and her mouth small, and of a vermilion colour. Her teeth are like 2 rows of pearls, and surpass the finest in whiteness. When she moves her tongue to speak, she utters a sweet and most agreeable voice, and expresses herself in such terms as sufficiently indicate the vivacity of her wit. The whitest alabaster is not fairer than her neck. In a word, by this imperfect sketch you may guess there is no beauty likely to exceed her in the world. Anyone that did not know the king, the father of this incomparable princess, would be apt to imagine from the great respect and kindness he shows her that he was enamored with her. Never did a lover more for the most beloved mistress than he has been seen to do for her. The most violent jealousy never suggested such measures as his care has led him to adopt to keep her from every one but the man who is to marry her. And that the retreat in which he has resolved to place her may not seem irksome, he has built for her 7 palaces, the most extraordinary and magnificent that ever were known. The first palace is of rock crystal, the second of brass, the third of fine steel, the fourth of another kind of brass more valuable than the former, and also than steel, the fifth of touchstone, the sixth of silver, and the seventh of massive gold. He has furnished these palaces most sumptuously, each in a manner corresponding to the materials of the structure. He has embellished the gardens with parterres of grass and flowers, intermixed with pieces of water, waterworks, jet d'eau, canals, cascades, and several great groves of trees, where the eye is lost in the perspective, and where the sun never enters, and all differently arranged. King Gower, in a word, has shown that his paternal love has led him to spare no expense. Upon the fame of this incomparable princess's beauty, the most powerful neighboring kings have sent ambassadors to solicit her in marriage. The King of China received them all in the same obliging manner, but as he resolved not to marry his daughter without her consent, and she did not like any of the parties, the ambassadors were forced to return as they came. As to the subject of their embassy, they were perfectly satisfied with the great honours and civilities they had received. Sir, said the princess to the king, her father, you have an inclination to see me married, and think to oblige me by it. But where shall I find such stately palaces and delicious gardens as are furnished me by your majesty? Through your good pleasure I am under no constraint, and have the same honours shown to me as are paid to yourself. These are advantages I cannot expect to find anywhere else, whoever may be my husband. Men love to be masters, and I have no inclination to be commanded. After several other embassies on the same occasion, there arrived one from a king more opulent and powerful than any of the preceding. This prince the King of China recommended to his daughter for her husband, urging many forcible arguments to show how much it would be to her advantage to accept him, but she entreated her father to excuse her compliance for the reason she had before urged. He pressed her, but instead of consenting, she lost all the respect due to the king her father. Sir, said she in anger, talk to me no more of this or any other match, unless you would have me plunge this dagger in my bosom to deliver myself from your importunities. The king, greatly enraged, said, daughter, you are mad, and I must treat you accordingly. In a word, he had her shut up in a single apartment of one of his palaces, and allowed her only 10 old women to wait upon her and keep her company, the chief of whom had been her nurse. That the kings, his neighbours who had sent embassies to him on her account, might not think any more of her, he dispatched envoys to them severally to let them know how averse his daughter was to marriage. And as he did not doubt but she was really mad, he charged them to make known in every court that if there were any physician that would undertake to cure her, he should, if he succeeded, have her for his pains. Fair Maimoun, continued Danhasch, all that I have told you is true, and I have gone every day regularly to contemplate this incomparable beauty, to whom I would be sorry to do the least harm, notwithstanding my natural inclination to mischief. Come and see her, I conjure you. It would be well worth your while, when you have seen from your own observation that I am no liar. I am persuaded you will think yourself obliged to me for the sight of a princess unequalled in beauty. Instead of answering Danhasch, Maimoun burst out into violent laughter, which lasted for some time, and Danhasch, not knowing what might be the occasion of it, was astonished beyond measure. When she had done laughing, she exclaimed, Good, good, very good. You would have me then believe all you have told me. I thought you designed to tell me something surprising and extraordinary, and you've been talking all this while of a mad woman. Fie, what would you say, cursed genie, if you had seen the beautiful prince from whom I am just come, and whom I love as he deserves? I am confident you would soon give up the contest, and not pretend to compare your choice with mine. Agreeable, Maimoun, replied Danhasch. May I presume to ask who this prince you speak of is? No, answered Maimoun, the same thing has happened to him as to your princes. The king, his father, would have married him against his will, but after much importunity, he frankly told him he would have nothing to do with a wife. For this reason he is at this moment imprisoned in an old tower where I reside. I will not absolutely contradict you, replied Danhasch, But, my pretty lady, you must give me leave to be of opinion, till I have seen your prince, that no mortal upon earth can equal my princess in beauty. Hold thy tongue, cursed sprite, replied Maimoun. I tell thee once more thou art wrong. I will not contend with you, said Danhasch, but the way to be convinced whether what I say be true or false is to accept of my proposal to go and see my princess, and after that I will go with you to your prince. There is no need I should be at so much trouble, replied Maimoun. There is another way to satisfy us both, and that is for you to bring your princess and place her at my prince's bedside. By this means it will be easy for us to compare them together and determine the dispute. Danhasch consented and determined to set out immediately for China, but Maimoun drew him aside and told him she must first show him the tower whither he was to bring the princess. They flew together to the tower, and when Maimoun had strewn it to Danhasch, she cried, Go fetch your princess and do it quickly. You will find me here. Danhasch left Maimoun and flew towards China, whence he soon returned with incredible speed, bringing the fair princess along with him asleep. Maimoun received him and introduced him into the chamber of Kumir al-Zaman, where they placed the princess by the prince's side. When the prince and princess were thus laid together, there arose a sharp contest between the genie and the fairy about the preference of their beauty. They were some time admiring and comparing them without speaking. At length Danhasch said to Maimoun, You see, and I've already told you, my princess was handsomer than your prince. Now I hope you are convinced. How convinced? Replied Maimoun. I'm not convinced, and you must be blind if you cannot see that my prince excels in the comparison. That the princess is fair I do not deny, but if you compare them together without prejudice, you will soon see the difference. How much soever I may compare them, returned Danhasch, I shall never change my opinion. I saw at first sight what I now behold, and time will not make me see differently. However, this shall not hinder my yielding to you, charming Maimoun, if you desire it. What, have you yielded me as a favour? I scorn it, said Maimoun. I would not receive a favour at the hand of such a wicked genie. I will refer the matter to an umpire, and if you do not consent, I shall win by your refusal. Danhasch, who was ready to have shown a different kind of complaisance, no sooner gave his consent than Maimoun stamped with her foot. The earth opened, and out came a hideous, humpbacked, squinting and lame genie, with 6 horns upon his head, and claws on his hands and feet. As soon as he was come out, and the earth had closed, perceiving Maimoun, he threw himself at her feet, and then rising on one knee, inquired her commands. Rise, Cash, said Maimoun. I brought you hither to determine a difference between me and this cursed Danhasch. Look on that bed and tell me without partiality who is the handsomer of those two that lie there asleep, the young man or the young lady. Cash looked on the prince and princess with great attention, admiration, and surprise, and after he had considered them a good while, without being able to determine, he turned to Maimoun and said, Madam, I must confess I should deceive you and betray myself if I pretended to say one was handsomer than the other. The more I examine them, the more clearly it appears to me each possesses, in a sovereign degree, the beauty of which both partake. Neither of them appears to have the least defect, to yield to the other the palm of superiority. But if there be any difference, the best way to determine it is to awaken them one after the other, and to agree that the person who shall express most love for the other by ardor, eagerness, and passion shall be deemed to have in some respect less beauty. This proposal of Cash's pleased both Maimoun and Danhasch. Maimoun then changed herself into a flea, and leaping on the prince's neck, stung him so smartly that he awoke and put up his hand to the place. But Maimoun skipped away and resumed her pristine form, which, like those of the 2 genies, was invisible, the better to observe what he would do. In drawing back his hand, the prince chanced to let it fall on that of the Princess of China. He opened his eyes and was exceedingly surprised to find lying by him a lady of the greatest beauty. He raised his head and leaned on his elbow, the better to observe her. Her blooming youth and incomparable beauty fired him in a moment with the flame of which he had never yet been sensible, and from which he had hitherto guarded himself with the greatest attention. Love seized on his heart in the most lively manner, and he exclaimed, What beauty, what charms, my heart, my soul! As he spoke, he kissed her forehead, her cheeks, and her mouth, with so little caution that he would have awakened her had she not slept sounder than ordinary through the enchantment of Danhasch. How, said the prince, do you not awake at these testimonies of love? He was going to awake her, but suddenly refrained. Is not this she, said he, that the Sultan my father would have had me marry? He was in the wrong not to let me see her sooner. I should not have offended him by my disobedience and passionate language to him in public, and he would have spared himself the confusion which I have occasioned him. The prince began to repent sincerely of the fault he had committed, and was once more on the point of awakening the Princess of China. It may be, said he, that the Sultan my father has a mind to surprise me, and has sent this young lady to try if I had really that aversion to marriage which I pretended. Who knows but he has brought her himself, and is hidden behind the hangings to observe me and make me ashamed of my dissimulation. The second fault would be greater than the first. At all events, I will content myself with this ring as a remembrance of her. He then gently drew off a ring which the princess had on her finger, and immediately replaced it with one of his own. After this he fell into a more profound sleep than before, through the enchantment of the genies. Danhasch now transformed himself into a flea in his turn, and bit the princess so rudely on the lip that she awoke, started up, and on opening her eyes was not a little surprised to see a man lying by her side. From surprise she proceeded to admiration, and from admiration to a transport of joy at beholding so beautiful and lovely a youth. What, cried she, is it you, the king, my father, has designed me for a husband? Would that I had known it, for then I should not have displeased him, nor been deprived of a husband whom I cannot forbear loving. Awake, then, awake. End of section 21. Section 22 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Qamar al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badoura, Princess of China, Part 3. So saying, she took the prince by the arm and shook him so violently that he would have awaked had not Maimun increased his sleep by her enchantment. She shook him several times, and finding he did not awake, exclaimed, What is come to thee? What jealous rival, envying thy happiness and mine, has had recourse to magic to throw thee into this unconquerable drowsiness when thou shouldst be most awake? Tired at length with her fruitless endeavours to awaken the prince, Since, said she, I find it is not in my power to awake thee, I will no longer disturb thy repose, but wait our next meeting. After having kissed his cheek, she lay down and fell asleep by enchantment. Maimun now cried out to Danhasch, Ah, cursed genie, art thou not now convinced how much thy princess is inferior to my prince? Another time, believe me, when I assert anything. Then turning to Cash, As for you, said she, I thank you for your trouble. Take the princess in conjunction with Danhasch, and convey her back again to her bed from whence he has taken her. Danhasch and Cash did as they were commanded, and Maimun retired to her well. Qamar al-Zaman, on waking next morning, looked if the lady whom he had seen the night before were by him. When he found she was gone, he cried out, I thought indeed this was a trick the king my father designed to play me. I'm glad I was aware of it. He then awaked the slave who was still asleep, and after he had washed and said his prayers, took a book and read some time. After these usual exercises, he called the slave and said to him, Come hither, and be sure you do not tell me a lie. How came the lady hither who lay with me tonight, and who brought her? My lord, answered the slave with great astonishment, I know not what lady your highness speaks of. I speak, said the prince, of her who came, or rather was brought hither, and lay with me tonight. My lord, replied the slave, I swear I know of no such lady, and how should she come in without my knowledge, since I lay at the door? You are a lying knave, replied the prince, and in the plot to vex and provoke me. He then gave him a box on the ear, which knocked him down, and after having stamped upon him for some time, he tied the well rope under his arms, and plunged him several times into the water, neck and heels. I will drown thee, cried he, if thou dost not tell me directly who this lady was, and who brought her. The slave, perplexed and half-dead, said within himself, "The prince must have lost his senses through grief, and I shall not escape if I do not tell him a falsehood." "My lord," cried he, in a suppliant tone, "I beseech your highness to spare my life, and I will tell you the truth." The prince drew the slave up and pressed him to tell him. As soon as he was out of the well, "My lord," said he, trembling, "your highness must perceive it is impossible for me to satisfy you in my present condition. I beg you to give me leave first to go and change my clothes." "I permit you, but do it quickly," said the prince, "and be sure you conceal nothing." The slave went out, and having locked the door upon the prince, ran to the palace just as he was. The king was at that time in discourse with his prime vizier, to whom he had just related the grief in which he had passed the night on account of his son's disobedience and opposition to his will. The minister endeavored to comfort his master by telling him the prince himself had given him cause for his severity. "Sir," said he, "your majesty need not repent of having treated your son in this manner. Have but patience to let him continue a while in prison, and assure yourself his heat will abate, and he will submit to all you require." The Grand Vizier had but just done speaking, when the slave came in, and cast himself at the feet of the sovereign. "My lord," said he, "I'm sorry to be the messenger of ill news to your majesty, which I know must occasion you fresh affliction. The prince is distracted. He raves of a lady having lain with him all night, and his treatment of me, as you may see, too plainly proves the state of his mind." Then he proceeded to relate the particulars of what the prince had said, and the violence with which he had been treated. The king, who did not expect to hear anything of this afflicting kind, said to the prime minister, "This is a melancholy turn, very different from the hopes you gave me. Go immediately and examine the condition of my son." The Grand Vizier obeyed, and coming into the prince's chamber, found him sitting on his bed with a book in his hand which he was reading. After mutual salutations, the vizier said, "My lord, I wish that a slave of yours were punished for coming to alarm the king your father by news that he has brought him." "What is it," demanded the prince, "that could give my father so much uneasiness?" "Prince," answered the vizier, "God forbid that the intelligence he has conveyed to your father concerning you should be true. Indeed, I find it to be false, by the calm temper in which I observe you, and which I pray you to continue." "It may be," replied the prince. He did not make himself well understood, "but since you are come, who ought to know something of the matter, permit me to ask you who that lady was that lay with me last night." The Grand Vizier was thunderstruck at this question. He recovered himself and said, "My lord, be not surprised at my astonishment at your question. Is it possible that a lady or any other person should penetrate by night into this place without entering at the door and walking over the body of your slave? I beseech you, recollect yourself, and you will find it is only a dream which has made this impression on you." "I give no ear to what you say," replied the prince, raising his voice. "I must know from you absolutely what is become of the lady, and if you hesitate, I'm in a place where I shall soon be able to force you to obey me." At this stern language, the Grand Vizier began to feel more alarmed than before, and to think how he could extricate himself. He endeavored to pacify the prince, and begged of him in the most humble and guarded manner to tell him if he had seen this lady. Yes, yes," answered the prince, "I've seen her, and am very well satisfied you sent her here to tempt me. She played the part in which you had instructed her admirably well. She pretended to be asleep, and I had no sooner fallen into a slumber than she arose and left me. You know all this, for I doubt not she has been to make her report to you." "My lord," replied the vizier, "I swear to you nothing of this kind has been acted. Neither your father nor I sent this lady you speak of. Permit me, therefore, once more to suggest to your highness that you have only seen this lady in a dream." "Do you come to affront and contradict me?" said the prince in a rage, "and to tell me to my face that what I have told you is a dream?" At the same time he took him by the beard and loaded him with blows as long as he could stand. The Grand Vizier endured with respectful patience all the violence of the prince's indignation, and could not help saying within himself, "Now am I in as bad a condition as the slave, and shall think myself happy if I can, like him, escape from any further danger. In the midst of repeated blows, he cried out but for a moment's audience, which the prince, after he had nearly tired himself with beating him, consented to give him. I own, my prince, said the Grand Vizier, dissembling, there is something in what your highness suspects, but you cannot be ignorant of the necessity a minister is under to obey his royal master's commands. Yet if you will but be pleased to set me at liberty, I will go and tell him anything on your behalf that you shall think fit to require. Go then, said the prince, and tell him from me, if he pleases, I will marry the lady he sent me, or rather that was brought to me last night. Do this immediately, and bring me a speedy answer. The Grand Vizier made a profound reverence, and went away, not thinking himself altogether safe till he had got out of the tower, and had closed the door on the prince. He came and presented himself before Shah Zuman, with a countenance that sufficiently showed he had been ill used, and which the king could not behold without concern. Well, said the king, in what condition did you find my son? Sir, answered the vizier, what the slave reported to your majesty is but true. He then began to relate his interview with the prince, how he flew into a passion upon his endeavouring to persuade him it was impossible the lady he spoke of should have been introduced, the ill treatment he had received from him, how he had used him, and by what means he had made his escape. The king, the more concerned as he loved the prince with excessive tenderness, resolved to find out the truth, and therefore proposed to go himself and see his son in the tower, accompanied by the Grand Vizier. The prince received his father in the tower, where he was confined with great respect. The king put several questions to him, which he answered calmly. The king every now and then looked on the Grand Vizier, as intimating he did not find his son had lost his wits, but rather thought he had lost his. The king at length spoke of the lady to the prince. My son, said he, I desire you to tell me what lady it was who lay with you last night. Sir, answered the prince, I beg of your majesty not to give me more vexation on that head, but rather to oblige me by letting me have her in marriage. Whatever aversion I may hitherto have discovered for women, this young lady has charmed me to that degree that I cannot help confessing my weakness. I am ready to receive her at your majesty's hands with the deepest gratitude. Shah Zuman was surprised at this answer of the prince, so remote, as he thought, from the good sense he had strewn before. My son, said he, you fill me with the greatest astonishment by what you say. I swear to you I know nothing of the lady you mention, and if any such has come to you, it was without my knowledge or privily. But how could she get into this tower without my consent? For whatever my Grand Vizier told you, it was only to appease your anger. It must therefore be a mere dream, and I beg of you not to believe otherwise, but recover your senses. Sir, replied the prince, I should be forever unworthy of your majesty's favour if I did not give entire credit to what you are pleased to say, but I humbly beseech you at the same time to give a patient hearing to what I shall relate, and then to judge whether what I have the honour to tell you be a dream or not. The prince then related to his father how he had been awaked, exaggerating the beauty and charms of the lady he found by his side, the instantaneous love he conceived for her, and the pains he took to awaken her without effect. Showing the king the ring he had taken from her finger, he added, After this, I hope you will be convinced that I have not lost my senses, as you have been almost made to believe. Shah Zaman was so perfectly convinced of the truth of what his son had been telling him that he could make no reply, remaining astonished for some time and not being able to utter a syllable. The prince took advantage of this opportunity and said, The passion I have conceived for this charming lady, whose lovely image I bear continually in my mind, is so ardent that I cannot resist it. I entreat you therefore to have compassion and procure me the happiness of being united to her. Son, replied the king, after what I have just heard and what I see by the ring on your finger, I cannot doubt but that your passion is real, and that you have seen this lady, who is the object of it. Would to God I knew who she was. I would instantly comply with your wishes, and should be the happiest father in the world. But where shall I seek her? How came she here? And by what conveyance, without my consent? Why did she come to sleep with you only to display her beauty, to kindle a flame of love while she slept, and then leave you while you were in a slumber? These things I must confess I do not understand, and if heaven do not favour us in our perplexity, I fear we must both go down to the grave together. As he spoke, he took the prince by the hand and said, Come then, my son, let us go and grieve together, you with hopeless love, and I with seeing your affliction without being able to afford you relief. Shah Zuman then led his son out of the tower, and conveyed him to the palace, where he had no sooner arrived than in despair at loving an unknown object he fell sick and took to his bed. The king shut himself up with him, without attending to the affairs of his kingdom for many days. The prime minister, who was the only person that had admittance, at length informed him that the whole court, and even the people, began to murmur at not seeing him, and that he did not administer justice every day, as he was wont to do, adding, he knew not what disorder it might occasion. I humbly beg your majesty, therefore, proceeded he, to pay some attention. I am sensible your majesty's company is a great comfort to the prince, and that his tends to relieve your grief, but you must not run the risk of letting all be lost. Permit me to propose to your majesty to remove with the prince to the castle near the port, where you may give audience to your subjects twice a week only. During these absences the prince will be so agreeably amused with the beauty, prospect, and good air of the place, that he will bear them with the less uneasiness. The king approved this proposal. He removed thither with the prince, and excepting when he gave audience, never left him, but passed all his time endeavouring to comfort him by sharing his distress. Whilst matters passed thus in the capital of Shah Zuman, the two genies, Danhash and Kashkash, had carried the princess of China back to the palace, where the king her father had confined her, and laid her in her bed as before. When she awoke next morning and found that Prince Kumir al-Zaman was not by her, she cried out in such a manner to her women that she soon brought them to her bed. Her nurse, who arrived first, desired to be informed if anything disagreeable had happened to her. Tell me, said the princess, what has become of the young man that has passed the night with me, and whom I love with all my soul. Madam, replied the nurse, we cannot understand your highness, unless you will be pleased to explain yourself. A young man, the handsomest and most amiable, said the princess, slept with me last night, whom, with all my caresses, I could not awake. I ask you where he is. Madam, answered the nurse, your highness asks us these questions in jest. I beseech you to rise. I am in earnest, said the princess, and I must know where this young man is. Madam, insisted the nurse, you were alone when you went to bed last night, and how any man could come to you without our knowledge we cannot imagine, for we all lay about the door of your chamber, which was locked, and I had the key in my pocket. At this the princess lost all patience, and taking her nurse by the hair of her head, and giving her 2 or 3 sound cuffs, cried, you shall tell me where this young man is, you old sorceress, or I will put you to death. The nurse struggled to get from her, and at last succeeded. She went immediately with tears in her eyes, and her face all bloody, to complain to the queen, who was not a little surprised to see her in this condition, and asked who had misused her. Madam, began the nurse, you see how the princess has treated me. She had certainly murdered me if I had not had the good fortune to escape out of her hands. She then related what had been the cause of all that violent passion in the princess. The queen was surprised at her account, and could not guess how she came to be so infatuated as to take that for a reality which could be no other than a dream. Your majesty must conclude from all this, continued the nurse, that the princess is out of her senses. You will think so yourself if you will go and see her. The queen's affection for the princess deeply interested her in what she heard. She ordered the nurse to follow her, and they immediately went together to the princess's palace. End of section 22. Section 23 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Kumir al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badara, Princess of China, Part 4. The Queen of China sat down by her daughter's bedside on her arrival in her apartment, and after she had informed herself about her health, began to ask her what had made her so angry with her nurse as to treat her in the manner she had done. Daughter, said she, this is not right, and a great princess like you should not suffer herself to be so transported by passion. Madam, replied the princess, I plainly perceive your majesty has come to mock me, but I declare I will never let you rest till you consent to my marrying the young man who lay with me last night. You must know where he is, and therefore I beg of your majesty to let him come to me again. Daughter, answered the queen, you surprise me. I do not understand your meaning. The princess now forgot all respect for the queen. Madam, replied she, the king my father, and you have persecuted me about marrying when I had no inclination. I now have an inclination, and I will have this young man I told you of for my husband, or I will destroy myself. The queen endeavored to calm the princess by conciliatory language. Daughter, said she, you know well you are guarded in this apartment. How then could any man come to you? but instead of attending to her, the princess interrupted her by such extravagancies as obliged the queen to leave her and retire in great affliction to inform the king of all that had passed. When the king had heard the account, he wished likewise to be satisfied in person, and coming to his daughter's apartment, asked her if what he had been told was true. Sir, replied the princess, let us talk no more of that. I only beseech your majesty to grant me the favour that I may marry the young man I lay with last night. What, daughter, said the king, has anyone lain with you last night? How, sir, replied the princess, without giving him time to go on, do you ask me if anyone lay with me last night? Your majesty knows that but too well. He was the most beautiful youth the sun ever saw. I ask him of you for my husband. I entreat you, do not refuse me, but that your majesty may not longer doubt whether I have seen this young man, whether he has lain with me, whether I have caressed him, or whether I did not my utmost to awake him without succeeding. See, if you please, this ring. She then reached forth her hand and showed the king a man's ring on her finger. The king was perplexed what to think. He had confined his daughter as mad. He began now to think her more insane than ever. Without saying anything more to her, lest she might do violence to herself or somebody about her, he had her chained and confined more closely than before, allowing her only the nurse to wait on her with a good guard at the door. The king, exceedingly concerned at this indisposition of his daughter, sought all possible means to effect a cure. He assembled his council, and after having acquainted them with her condition, if any of you, said he, is capable of undertaking to restore her to health and succeed, I will give her to him in marriage and make him heir to my dominions. The desire of obtaining a handsome young princess and the hopes of one day governing so great a kingdom as that of China had a powerful effect on an emir already advanced in years, who was present at this council. As he was well skilled in magic, he offered the king to recover his daughter, and flattered himself with success. I consent to the trial, said the king, but I forgot to tell you one condition, and that is that if you do not succeed, you shall lose your head. It would not be reasonable you should have so great a reward, and yet run no risk. And what I say to you, continued the king, I say to all others who shall come after you, that they may consider beforehand what they undertake. The emir accepted the condition, and the king conducted him to the princess's place of confinement. She covered her face as soon as she saw them enter, and exclaimed, Your Majesty surprises me in bringing with you a man whom I do not know, and by whom my religion forbids me to let myself be seen. Daughter, replied the king, you need not be scandalized. It is only one of my emirs who has come to demand you in marriage. It is not, I perceive, the person that you have already given me, and whose faith is plighted by the ring I wear, replied the princess. Be not offended, but I will never marry any other. The emir expected the princess would have said or done some extravagant thing, and was not a little disappointed when he heard her talk so calmly and rationally, for he then concluded that her disease was nothing but a violent and deep-rooted passion. He therefore threw himself at his majesty's feet and said, After what I have heard and observed, sir, it will be to no purpose for me to think of curing the princess, since I have no remedies proper for her malady, for which reason I humbly submit my life to your majesty's pleasure. The king, enraged at his incapacity and the trouble he had given him, caused him to be immediately beheaded. Some days after, unwilling to have it said that he had neglected his daughter's cure, the king put forth a proclamation in his capital, importing that if there were any physician, astrologer, or magician who would undertake to restore the princess to her senses, he needed only to offer himself, and he should be employed on condition of losing his head. If he failed, he had the same published in the other principal cities and towns of his dominions, and in the courts of the princes his neighbors. The first that presented himself was an astrologer and magician, whom the king caused to be conducted to the princess's prison by an eunuch. The astrologer drew forth out of a bag he carried under his arm an astrolabe, a small sphere, a chafing dish, several sorts of drugs proper for fumigations, a brass pot with many other articles, and desired he might have a fire. The princess demanded what all these preparations were for. Madam, answered the eunuch, they are to exorcise the evil spirit that possesses you, to shut him up in this pot and throw him into the sea. Foolish astrologer, replied the princess, I have no occasion for any of your preparations, but am in my perfect senses, and you alone are mad. If your art can bring him I love to me, I shall be obliged to you. Otherwise you may go about your business, for I have nothing to do with you. Madam, said the astrologer, if your case be so, I shall desist from all endeavors believing the king your father only can remove your disorder. So putting up his trinkets again, he marched away, much concerned that he had so easily undertaken to cure an imaginary malady. The eunuch conducted the astrologer to the king, whom the astrologer thus addressed: "According to what your majesty published in your proclamation, and what you were pleased to confirm to me yourself, I thought the princess was insane, and depended on being able to recover her by the secrets I've long been acquainted with, but I soon found she had no other disease but that of love, over which my art has no power. Your majesty alone is the physician who can cure her, by giving her in marriage the person whom she desires." The king was much enraged at the astrologer, and had his head instantly cut off. 150 astrologers, physicians, and magicians came on this account, who all underwent the same fate, and their heads were set upon poles on every gate of the city. The princess of China's nurse had a son whose name was Marzavan, who had been foster brother to the princess and brought up with her. The friendship was so great during their childhood, and all the time they had been together, that as they grew up, even some time after their separation, they treated each other as brother and sister. Marzavan, among other studies, had from his youth been much addicted to judicial astrology, geomancy, and the like secret arts, wherein he became exceedingly skilful. Not satisfied with what he had learned from masters, he travelled, and there was hardly any person of note in any science or art, but he sought him in the most remote cities to obtain information, so great was his thirst after knowledge. After several years' absence in foreign parts, he returned to the capital of his native country, where, seeing so many heads on the gate by which he entered, he was exceedingly surprised, and demanded for what reason they had been placed there. But he more particularly inquired after the princess, his foster sister. As he could not receive an answer to one inquiry without the other, he heard at length a general account of what had happened, and waited for further particulars till he could see his mother, the princess's nurse. Although the nurse, the mother of Marzavan, was much employed about the princess, yet she no sooner heard her son was returned than she found time to come out, embrace him, and converse with him a little. Having told him, with tears in her eyes, the unhappy condition of the princess, and for what reason the king her father had confined her, her son desired to know if she could not procure him a private view of her royal mistress without the king's knowledge. After some pause, she told him she could give him no answer for the present, but if he would meet her the next day at the same hour, she would inform him. The nurse, knowing none could approach the princess but herself, without leave of the eunuch who commanded the guard at the gate, addressed herself to him, and said, "You know I have brought up and suckled the princess, and you may likewise have heard that I had a daughter whom I brought up along with her. This daughter has been since married, yet the princess still does her the honour to love her, and wishes to see her without any persons observing her enter or depart." The nurse was proceeding, but the eunuch interrupted her, and exclaimed, "Say no more. I will with pleasure do anything to oblige the princess. Go and fetch your daughter, or send for her about midnight, and the gate shall be open for you." As soon as it was dark, the nurse went to Marzavan, and having dressed him so well in women's clothes that nobody could suspect he was a man, carried him along with her, and the eunuch, believing it was her daughter, admitted them. The nurse, before she presented Marzavan, went to the princess and said, "Madam, this is not a woman I have brought to you. It is my son Marzavan, in disguise, newly arrived from his travels, having a great desire to kiss your hand. I hope your highness will vouchsafe him that honour." "What, my brother Marzavan?" exclaimed the princess with great joy. "Approach and take off that veil, for it is not unreasonable that a brother and a sister should see each other without covering their faces." Marzavan saluted her with profound respect, while, without giving him time to speak, she continued, "I rejoice to see you returned in good health after so many years' absence, and without sending any account of your welfare, even to your good mother." "Madam," replied Marzavan, "I am infinitely obliged to your goodness. I hope to have heard a better account of your health than has been given me, and which I lament to find confirmed by your appearance. It gives me pleasure, however, to have come so seasonably to bring your highness that remedy which your situation requires. Should I reap no other benefit from my studies and travels, I should think myself amply recompensed." Having thus spoken, Marzavan drew out of his pocket a book, and some other things which, from the account he had from his mother of the princess's distemper, he thought he might want. The princess, observing these preparations, exclaimed, "What, brother, are you one of those who believe me mad? Undeceive yourself and hear me." The princess then related to Marzavan all the particulars of her story, without omitting the least circumstance, even to the ring which was exchanged for hers, and which she showed him. "I have not concealed the least incident from you," continued she. "There is something in this business which I cannot comprehend, and which has given occasion for some persons to think me mad. but no one will attend to the rest, which is literally as I have stated. After the princes had concluded, Marzavan, filled with wonder and astonishment, remained for some time with his eyes fixed on the ground, without speaking a word, but at length he lifted up his head and said, "If it be as your highness says, and which I do not in the least doubt, I do not despair of being able to procure you the gratification of your wishes, but I must first entreat your highness to arm yourself with patience, till I have travelled over kingdoms which I have not yet visited, and when you hear of my return, be assured the object of your desire is not far distant." Having thus spoken, Marzavan took leave of the princess, and set out the next morning on his intended travels. He journeyed from city to city, from province to province, and from island to island, and in every place he visited he could hear of nothing but the Princess Badoura, which was the princess of China's name, and her history. About 4 months after, our traveller arrived at Torf, a seaport town, large and populous, where the theme was changed. He no more heard of the Princess Badoura, but all the talk was of Prince Kumir al-Zaman, who was sick and whose history greatly resembled hers. Marzavan was extremely delighted on hearing this, and informed himself where the prince was to be found. There were 2 ways to it, one by land and sea, the other by sea only, which was the shortest. Marzavan chose the latter, and embarking on board a merchant ship, arrived safely in sight of Shah Zuman's capital, but just before it entered the port, the ship struck upon a rock by the unskilfulness of the pilot, and foundered. It went down in sight of the castle, where at that time were the king and his grand vizier. Marzavan, who could swim well, immediately upon the ship sinking, cast himself into the sea, and got safe on shore under the castle, where he was soon relieved by the grand vizier's order. After he had changed his clothes and been well treated, he was introduced to the grand vizier, who had sent for him. Marzavan, being a young man of good address, the minister received him with great politeness, and was induced, from the just and pertinent answers he returned to the questions put to him, to regard him with great esteem. Finding by degrees that he possessed great variety and extent of information, he said to him, "From what I can understand, I perceive you are no common man. You have travelled much. Would to God you had discovered some remedy for a malady which has been long a source of great affliction at this court." Marzavan replied if he knew what malady it was, he might perhaps find a remedy applicable to it. The Grand Vizier then related to him the story of Prince Kumir al-Zaman. He concealed nothing relating to his birth, which had been so earnestly desired, his education, the wish of the king, his father, to see him early married, his resistance and extraordinary aversion from marriage, his disobeying his father in full counsel, his imprisonment, his extravagancies in prison, which were afterwards changed into a violent passion for some unknown lady who he pretended had exchanged a ring with him, though for his part he verily believed there was no such person in the world. Marzavan gave great attention to all the Grand Vizier said, and was infinitely rejoiced to find that by means of his shipwreck he had so fortunately lighted on the person he was seeking. He saw no reason to doubt that the prince was the man whom the Princess of China so ardently loved, and that this princess was equally the object of his passion. Without explaining himself farther to the vizier, he desired to see the prince, that he might be better able to judge of his disorder and his cure. "Follow me," said the Grand Vizier, "and you will find the king within, who has already desired I should introduce you." On entering the prince's chamber, the first thing Marzavan observed was the prince upon his bed, languishing, and with his eyes shut, notwithstanding his condition, and regardless of the presence of the king his father, who was sitting by him. He could not avoid exclaiming, "Heavens, was there ever a greater resemblance?" He meant to the Princess of China, for it seems the princess and the prince were much alike. This exclamation of Marzavan excited the prince's curiosity. He opened his eyes and looked at him. Marzavan, who had a ready wit, seized that opportunity and made his compliment in extempore verse, but in such a disguised manner that neither the king nor the Grand Vizier understood his meaning. He represented so exactly what had happened to him with the Princess of China that the prince had no reason to doubt he knew her, and could give him tidings of her. His countenance immediately brightened up with joy. After Marzavan had finished his compliment in verse, which surprised Kumir al-Zaman so agreeably, the prince took the liberty of making a sign to the king his father to give his place to Marzavan and allow him to sit by him. The king, overjoyed at this alteration, which inspired him with hopes of his son's speedy recovery, quitted his place, and taking Marzavan by the hand, led him to it, obliging him to sit. He then demanded of him who he was, and whence he had come, and upon Marzavan's answering he was a subject of China, and came from that kingdom, the king exclaimed, "Heaven grant you may be able to recover my son from this profound melancholy. I shall be eternally obliged to you, and all the world shall see how handsomely I will reward you." Having said thus, he left the prince to converse at full liberty with the stranger. whilst he went and rejoiced with the Grand Vizier on this happy incident. Marzavan, leaning down to the prince, addressed him in a low voice. Prince, it is time you should cease to grieve. The lady for whom you suffer is the Princess Badoura, daughter of Gaur, King of China. This I can assure your highness from what she has told me of her adventure and what I have learned of yours. She has suffered no less on your account than you have on hers. Here he related all that he knew of the princess's story from the night of their extraordinary interview. He omitted not to acquaint him how the king had treated those who had failed in their endeavours to cure the princess of her indisposition. But your highness is the only person, added he, that can cure her effectually, and you may present yourself without fear. However, before you undertake so long a voyage, I would have you perfectly recovered, and then we will take what measures may be necessary. Think then immediately of the recovery of your health. This account had a marvellous effect on the prince. The hopes of speedily fulfilling his desires so much relieved him that he felt he had strength sufficient to rise and beg permission of his father to dress himself with such an air as gave him incredible pleasure. Shah Zuman, without inquiring into the means he had used to produce this wonderful effect, could not refrain from embracing Marzavan, and soon after went out of the prince's chamber with the Grand Vizier to publish the agreeable tidings. He ordered public rejoicings for several days together, gave great largesses to his officers and the people, and alms to the poor, and caused the prisoners to be set at liberty throughout his kingdom. The joy was soon general in the capital and in every part of his dominions. Kumir al-Zaman, though extremely weakened by almost continual privation of sleep and long abstinence, soon recovered his health. When he found himself in a condition to undertake the voyage, he took Marzavan aside and said, Dear Marzavan, it is now time to perform the promise you have made me. My impatience to behold the charming princess and to relieve her of the torment she is now suffering on my account is such that if we do not shortly depart, I shall relapse into my former indisposition. One thing still afflicts me, continued he, and that is the difficulty I shall find from his tender affection for me to obtain my father's permission to travel into a distant country. You observe he scarcely allows me to be a moment out of his sight. At these words the prince wept. Marzavan then replied, I foresaw this difficulty, and I will take care it shall not obstruct us. My principal design in this voyage was to cure the princess of China of her malady, and this on account of the mutual affection which we have borne to each other from our birth, as well as from the zeal and affection I otherwise owe her. I should therefore be wanting in my duty to her if I did not use my best endeavours to effect her cure and yours. This is then the mode I have devised to obtain the king your father's consent. You have not stirred abroad for some time, therefore request his permission to go upon a hunting party with me. He will no doubt comply. When you have obtained his leave, obtain 2 fleet coursers for each of us to be got ready, one to mount, the other to change, and leave the rest to me. End of section 23. Section 24 of the Arabian Nights, Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Kumir al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badoura, Princess of China, Part 5. The following day the prince did as he had been instructed. He acquainted the king, who he was desirous of taking the air, and if he pleased would go and hunt for 2 or 3 days with Marzavan. The king gave his consent, but wished him not to be absent more than 1 night, since too much exercise at first might impair his health, and a longer absence would make him uneasy. He then ordered him to choose the best horses in the royal stable, and took particular care that nothing should be wanting for his accommodation. When all was ready, he embraced the prince, and having recommended to Marzavan to be careful of him, he let him go. Kumir al-Zaman and Marzavan were soon mounted, when, to amuse the 2 grooms who led the spare horses, they made as if they were going to hunt, and under this pretense got as far from the city and out of the high road as was possible. When night began to approach, they alighted at a caravanserai, or inn, where they supped and slept till about midnight, when Marzavan awakened the prince, and desired his highness to let him have his dress, and to take another for himself which was brought in his baggage. Thus equipped they mounted the fresh horses, and after Marzavan had taken one of the groom's horses by the bridle, they left the caravanserai. At daybreak they found themselves in a forest, where 4 roads met. Here Marzavan, desiring the prince to wait for him a little, went into the wood. He then cut the throat of the groom's horse, and after having torn the suit which the prince had taken off, and besmeared it with blood, threw it into the highway. The prince inquired his reason for what he had done. He replied he was sure that when the king his father found he did not return, and should learn that he had departed without the grooms, he would suspect something wrong, and immediately send in quest of them. They who may come this way, finding this bloody habit, will conclude you are devoured by wild beasts, and that I have escaped to avoid the king's anger. The king, concluding you are dead, will stop further pursuit, and we may have leisure to continue our journey without fear of being followed. I must confess, continued Marzavan, it is a violent way of proceeding to alarm a fond father with the death of his son, but his joy will be the greater when he shall hear you are alive and happy. Brave Marzavan, replied the prince, I cannot but approve such an ingenious stratagem, or sufficiently admire your conduct. You place me under fresh obligations to you. The prince and Marzavan, being well provided for their expenses, continued their journey both by land and sea, and found no other obstacle but the length of the time which it necessarily took up. They arrived at length at the capital of China, where Marzavan, instead of going to his house, carried the prince to a public inn. They remained there incognito 3 days, to rest themselves after the fatigue of the voyage, during which time Marzavan caused an astrologer's habit to be made for the prince. The 3 days being expired, they went together to the bath, where the prince put on his astrologer's dress. From thence Marzavan conducted him to the neighborhood of the king of China's palace, where he left him to go and inform his mother of his arrival. Kumir al-Zaman, instructed by Marzavan what he was to do, came next morning to the gate of the king's palace and cried aloud, I am an astrologer, and am come to cure the illustrious Princess Badur, daughter of the most high and mighty monarch Gaur, king of China, on the conditions proposed by his majesty, to marry her if I succeed, or else to lose my life for my fruitless and presumptuous attempt. Besides the guards and porters at the gate, this incident drew together a great number of people about the prince. There had been no physician, astrologer, or magician appeared for a long time, on this account being deterred by the many tragical examples of ill success that appeared before. It was therefore thought there remained no more of these professions in the world, or none so mad as those that had already forfeited their lives. The prince's appearances, noble air, and blooming youth made every one who saw him pity him. What mean you, sir, said some that were nearest to him, thus to expose a life of such promising expectations to certain death? Cannot the heads you see on all the gates of this city deter you from such an undertaking? In the name of God, consider what you do. Abandon this rash attempt and depart. The prince continued firm, notwithstanding all these remonstrances, and as he saw no one coming to introduce him, he repeated the same cry with a boldness that made everybody tremble. They all then exclaimed, Let him alone. He is resolved to die. God have mercy on his youth and his soul. He then proceeded to cry a third time, in the same manner, when the Grand Vizier came in person and introduced him to the King of China. As soon as the prince came into the presence, he bowed and kissed the ground. The king, who, among all that had hitherto presumptuously exposed their lives on this occasion, had not before seen one worthy of his attention, felt real compassion for Kumir al-Zaman on account of the danger to which he exposed himself. Young man, said he, I can hardly believe that at this age you can have acquired experience enough to dare attempt the cure of my daughter. I wish you may succeed, and would give her to you in marriage with all my heart, and with the greatest joy, more willingly than I should have done to others that have offered themselves before you. But I must declare to you at the same time, though with great concern, that if you fail, notwithstanding your noble appearance and your youth, you must lose your head. Sir, replied the prince, I have infinite obligations to your majesty for the honour you design me, and the great goodness you show to a stranger, but I desire your majesty to believe I would not have come from so remote a country as I have done, the name of which perhaps may be unknown in your dominions, if I had not been certain of the cure I propose. What would not the world say of my fickleness, if after such great fatigues and so many dangers as I have undergone in the pursuit, I should abandon this generous enterprise? Even your majesty would lose that esteem you have conceived for me. If I perish, I shall die with the satisfaction of not having forfeited your good opinion. I beseech your majesty, therefore, to keep me no longer from displaying the certainty of my art by the proof I am ready to afford. The king now commanded the eunuch who had the custody of the princess to introduce Kumir al-Zaman into her apartment, but before he would let him go, reminded him once more that he was at liberty to renounce his design, But the prince paid no regard to this, and with astonishing resolution and eagerness followed the eunuch. When they had entered a long gallery, at the end of which was the princess's apartment, the prince, who saw himself so near the object of his wishes, who had occasioned him so many tears, pushed on, and got before the eunuch. The eunuch, redoubling his pace, with difficulty got up to him. "Whither so fast?" cried he, taking him by the arm. "You cannot get in without me, and it should seem you have a great desire for death, thus to run to it headlong. Not one of all those many astrologers and magicians I have introduced before made such haste as yourself to a place whence I fear you will come but too soon." "Friend," replied the prince, looking earnestly on the eunuch, and continuing his pace, "this was because none of the astrologers you speak of were so confident in their art as I am. They were certain indeed they should die if they did not succeed, but they had no certainty of their success. On this account they had reason to tremble on approaching this spot, where I am sure to find my happiness." He had just spoken these words when he reached the door. The eunuch opened it and introduced him into a great hall, whence was an entrance into the princess's apartment, divided from it only by a piece of tapestry. The prince stopped before he entered, speaking more softly to the eunuch for fear of being heard by the princess. "To convince you," said he, "there is neither presumption, nor whim, nor youthful conceit in my undertaking. I leave it to your choice whether I shall cure the princess in your presence, or where we are, without going any farther or seeing her." The eunuch was amazed to hear the prince talk to him with such confidence. He left off jeering, and said seriously to him, "It is no matter where it is done, provided it be effected. Cure her how you will. If you succeed, you will gain immortal honor, not only in this court, but over all the world." The prince replied, "It would be best then to cure her without seeing her, that you may be witness of my skill. Notwithstanding my impatience to see a princess of her rank, who is to be my wife, yet out of respect to you, I will deprive myself of that pleasure for a little while." Being furnished with everything proper for an astrologer to carry about him, he took pen, ink, and paper out of his pocket and wrote the following billet to the princess. "The impassioned Kumir al-Zaman cannot recite the inexpressible pain he has endured since that fatal night in which your charms deprived him of the liberty which he had resolved to preserve. He only tells you that he devoted his heart to you in your charming slumbers, those abstinent slumbers which hindered him from beholding the brightness of your piercing eyes, notwithstanding all his endeavours to oblige you to open them. He presumed to present you with his ring as a token of his passion, and to take yours in exchange, which he encloses. If you condescend to return his as a reciprocal pledge of love, he will esteem himself the happiest of mankind. If not, the sentence of death, which your refusal must draw upon him, will be received with resignation, since he will perish on account of his love for you." When the prince had finished his billet, he folded it up and enclosed in it the princess's ring. "There, friend," said he to the eunuch, "carry this to your mistress. If it does not cure her, as soon as she reads it and sees what it contains, I give you leave to tell everybody that I am the most ignorant and impudent astrologer that ever existed." The eunuch, entering the Princess of China's apartment, gave her the packet, saying, "The boldest astrologer that ever lived is arrived here, and pretends that on reading this letter and seeing what it encloses, you will be cured. I wish he may prove neither a liar nor an impostor." The Princess Badoura took the billet and opened it with indifference, but when she saw the ring, she had not patience to read it through. She rose hastily, broke the chain that held her, ran to the door and opened it. They immediately recognized each other, tenderly embraced, and without being able to speak for excess of joy, looked at one another, wondering how they met again after their first interview. The princess's nurse, who ran to the door with her, made them come into her apartment, where the Princess Badoura gave the prince her ring, saying, "Take it. I cannot keep it without restoring yours, which I will never part with, neither can it be in better hands." The eunuch went immediately to inform the king of China of what had happened. "Sir," said he, "all the astrologers and doctors who have hitherto pretended to cure the princess were fools compared with the present. He made use neither of schemes, nor conjurations, or perfumes, nor anything else, but cured her without seeing her." The monarch was agreeably surprised at this intelligence, and going to the princess's apartment, he embraced her, and afterwards the prince, and taking his hand, joined it to the princess's, saying, "Happy stranger, whoever you are, I will keep my word and give you my daughter for your wife, though by what I see in you, it is impossible for me to believe you are really what you pretend and would have me take you to be." Kumir al-Zaman thanked the king in the most humble expressions, that he might the better show his gratitude, As for my condition, said he, I must own I'm not an astrologer. As your majesty has guessed, I only put on the habit of one, that I might succeed the more easily in my ambition to be allied to the most potent monarch in the world. I was born a prince, and the son of a king and of a queen. My name is Kumir al-Zaman. My father is Shah Zaman, who now reigns over the islands that are well known by the name of the Islands of the Children of Khaledan. He then related to him his history and how wonderful had been the origin of his love, that the princesses was altogether as marvelous, and that both were confirmed by the exchange of the 2 rings. When the prince had done speaking, the king said to him, This history is so extraordinary, it deserves to be known to posterity. I will take care it shall, and the original being deposited in my royal archives, I will spread copies of it abroad, that my own kingdoms and the kingdoms around me may know it. The marriage was solemnized the same day, and the rejoicings were universal all over the empire of China. Nor was Marzavan forgotten. The king gave him an honorable post in his court and a promise of further advancement. The prince and princess enjoyed the fullness of their wishes in the sweets of marriage, and the king kept continual feastings for several months to manifest his joy on the occasion. In the midst of these pleasures, Kumir al-Zaman dreamt one night that he saw his father on his bed at the point of death, and heard him thus address his attendants. My son, to whom I gave birth, my son whom I so tenderly loved, whom I bred with so much fondness, so much care, has abandoned me, and is himself the cause of my death. He awoke with a profound sigh, which alarmed the princess, who asked him the cause. Alas, my love, replied the prince, perhaps at the very moment while I am speaking, the king my father is no more. He then acquainted her with his melancholy dream, which occasioned him so much uneasiness. The princess, who studied to please him in everything, went to her father the next day, kissed his hand, and thus addressed him. I have a favor to beg of your majesty, and I beseech you not to deny me, but that you may not believe. I ask it at the solicitation of the prince my husband. I assure you beforehand, he knows nothing of my request. It is that you will grant me your permission to go with him and visit his father. Daughter, replied the king, though I shall be sorry to part with you for so long a time as a journey to a place so distant will require, yet I cannot disapprove of your resolution. It is worthy of yourself. Go, child, I give you leave, but on condition that you stay no longer than a year in Shah Zuman's court. I hope the king will agree to this, that we shall alternately see, he his son and his daughter-in-law, and I my daughter and my son-in-law. The princess communicated the king of China's consent to her husband, who was transported to receive it, and returned her thanks for this new token of her love. The king of China gave orders for preparations to be made for their departure, and when all things were ready, he accompanied the prince and princess several days' journey on their way. They parted at length with much affliction on both sides. The king embraced them, and having desired the prince to be kind to his daughter, and to love her always with the same tenderness he now did, he left them to proceed, and to divert himself hunted as he returned to his capital. When the prince and princess had recovered from their grief, they comforted themselves with considering how glad Shah Zuman would be to see them, and how they should rejoice to see the king. End of section 24. Section 25 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 2, 1754 to 1829. The story of the loves of Kumir al-Zaman, Prince of the Isles of the Children of Khaledan, and of Badura, Princess of China, Part 6. After traveling about a month, then, they one day entered a plain of great extent, planted at convenient distances with tall trees, forming an agreeable shade. The day being unusually hot, the prince thought it best to encamp there, and proposed it to Badura, who, having the same wish, the more readily consented. They alighted in one of the finest spots. A tent was presently set up. The princess, rising from the shade under which he had sat down, entered it. The prince then ordered his attendants to pitch their tents, and went himself to give directions. The princess, weary with the fatigues of the journey, bade her women untie her girdle, which they laid down by her, and she, falling asleep, they left her alone. Kumir al-Zaman, having seen all things in order, came to the tent where the princess was sleeping. He entered and sat down without making any noise, intending to repose himself. But observing the princess's girdle lying by her, he took it up and looked at the diamonds and rubies one by one. In viewing it, he observed a little purse hanging to it, sewed neatly on the stuff and tied fast with a riband. He felt it and found it contained something solid. Desirous to know what it was, he opened the purse and took out a cornelian, engraven with unknown figures and characters. "This cornelian," said the prince to himself, "must be something very valuable, or my princess would not carry it with so much care." It was Badoura's talisman, which the Queen of China had given her daughter as a charm that would keep her, as she said, from any harm as long as she had it about her. The prince, the better to look at the talisman, took it out to the light, the tent being dark, and while he was holding it up in his hand, a bird darted down from the air and snatched it away from him. One will easily conceive the concern and grief of the prince when he saw the bird fly away with the talisman. He was more troubled than words can express, and cursed his unseasonable curiosity by which his dear princess had lost a treasure that was so precious and so valued by her. The bird, having got its prize, settled on the ground, not far off, with the talisman in its mouth. The prince drew near it, hoping it would drop it, but as he approached, the bird took wing and settled again on the ground further off. Kumir al-Zaman followed, and the bird took a further flight. The prince, being very dexterous at a mark, thought to kill it with a stone, and still pursued. The further it flew, the more eager he grew in pursuing, keeping it always in view. Thus the bird drew him along from hill to valley, and valley to hill, all the day, every step leading him out of the way from the plain where he had left his camp and the Princess Badoura, and instead of perching at night on a bush, where he might probably have taken it, roosted on a high tree, safe from his pursuit. The prince, vexed to the heart at having taken so much pains to no purpose, thought of returning. "But," said he to himself, "which way shall I return? Shall I go down the hills and valleys which I have passed over? Shall I wander in darkness? And will my strength bear me out? How shall I dare appear before my princess without her talisman?" Overwhelmed with such thoughts and tired with the pursuit, sleep came upon him, and he lay down under a tree where he passed the night. He awoke the next morning before the bird had left the tree, and as soon as he saw it on the wing, followed it again the whole of that day, with no better success than he had done the last, eating nothing but herbs and fruit as he went. He did the same for 10 days together, pursuing the bird, and keeping it in view from morning to night, lying always under the tree where it roosted. On the 11th day the bird continued flying, and Kumir al-Zaman, pursuing it, came near a great city. When the bird had reached the walls, it flew over them, and the prince saw no more of it, so that he despaired of ever recovering the Princess Badoura's talisman. The prince, whose grief was beyond expression, went into the city, which was built on the seaside and had a vine port. He walked up and down the streets without knowing where he was or where to stop. At last he came to the port, in as great uncertainty as ever what he should do. Walking along the shore, he perceived the gate of a garden open, and an old gardener at work in it. The good man, looking up, saw he was a stranger and a Mussulman, and asked him to come in and shut the door after him. Kumir al-Zaman entered and demanded of the gardener why he was so cautious. "Because," replied the old man, "I see you are a stranger, newly arrived, and this city is inhabited for the most part by idolaters who have a mortal aversion to us Mussulmans, and treat a few of us that are here with great barbarity. I suppose you did not know this, and it is a miracle that you have escaped as you have thus far, these idolaters being very apt to fall upon strangers or draw them into a snare. I bless God who has brought you into a place of safety." Kumir al-Zaman thanked the honest gardener for his advice and the security he offered him in his house. He would have said more, but the good man interrupted him, saying, "Let us leave complimenting. You are weary and must want to refresh yourself. Come in and rest." He conducted him into his little hut, and after the prince had eaten heartily of what he set before him, with a cordiality that charmed him, he requested him to relate how he had come there. The prince complied, and when he had finished his story without concealing any part of it, asked him which was the nearest route to his father's territories, saying, "It is in vain for me to think of finding my princess where I left her after wandering 11 days from the spot by so extraordinary an adventure. Ah," continued he, "how do I know she is alive?" And saying this, he burst into tears. The gardener replied there was no possibility of his going thither by land. The ways were so difficult and the journey so long. Besides, there was no accommodation for his subsistence. or if there were, he must necessarily pass through the countries of so many barbarous nations that he would never reach his father's. It was a year's journey from the city where he then was to any country inhabited only by Mussulmans, that the quickest passage for him would be to go to the Isle of Ebene, whence he might easily transport himself to the Isles of the children of Khaledan, that a ship sailed from the port every year to Ebene, and he might take that opportunity of returning to those islands. The ship departed, said he, but a few days ago. If you had come a little sooner, you might have taken your passage in it. You must wait till it makes the voyage again, and if you will stay with me, and accept of my house, such as it is, you shall be as welcome to it as to your own. The prince was glad he had met with such an asylum in a place where he had no acquaintance. He accepted the offer and lived with the gardener till the time arrived that the ship was to sail to the Isle of Ebene. He spent the interval in working by day in the garden and passing the night in sighs, tears, and complaints, thinking of his dear Princess Badour. We must leave him in this place to return to the princess, whom we left asleep in her tent. The princess slept a long time, and when she awoke wondered that the prince was not with her. She called her women and asked if they knew where he was. They told her they saw him enter the tent, but did not see him go out. While they were talking to her, she took up her girdle, found her little purse open, and that the talisman was gone. She did not doubt but that the prince had taken it to see what it was, and that he would bring it back with him. She waited for him impatiently till night, and could not imagine what made him stay away from her so long. When it was quite dark and she could hear no tidings of him, she fell into violent grief. She cursed the talisman and him that made it, and had not she been restrained by duty, would have cursed the queen her mother, who'd given her such a fatal present. She was the more troubled because she could not imagine how her talisman should have caused the princess separation from her. She did not, however, lose her judgment, and came to a courageous resolution not common with persons of her sex. Only herself and her women knew of the prince's absence, for his men were reposing or asleep in their tents. The princess, fearing they would betray her if they had any knowledge of this circumstance, moderated her grief and forbade her women to say or do anything that might create the least suspicion. She then laid aside her own habit and put on one of Kumir al-Zaman's. She was so much like him that the next day when she came abroad, the male attendants took her for the prince. She commanded them to pack up their baggage and begin their march, and when all things were ready, she ordered one of her women to go into her litter, she herself mounting on horseback and riding by her side. She travelled several months by land and sea, the princess continuing the journey under the name of Kumir al-Zaman. They touched at Ebene in their way to the Isles of the children of Khaledan, and went to the capital of the island, where a king reigned whose name was Armanos. The persons who first landed giving out that the ship carried Prince Kumir al-Zaman, who was returning from a long voyage and was forced in by a storm, the news of his arrival was soon carried to court. King Armanos, accompanied by his courtiers, went immediately to wait on the prince, and met the princess just as she was landing and going to the palace that had been prepared for her. He received her as the son of a king, who was his friend and with whom he always kept up a good understanding. He conducted her to the palace, where an apartment was prepared for her and all her attendants, though she would fain have excused herself. He showed her all possible honor and entertained her 3 days together with extraordinary magnificence. At the end of this time, King Armanos, understanding that the princess intended proceeding on her voyage, charmed with the air and qualities of such an accomplished prince as he supposed her, took an opportunity when she was alone and spoke to her in this manner. You see, prince, that I am old, and to my great mortification have not a son to whom I may leave my crown. Heaven has only blessed me with one daughter, whose beauty cannot be better matched than with a prince of your rank and accomplishments. Instead of going home, stay and accept my crown, which I will resign in your favor. It is time for me to rest, and nothing could be a greater pleasure to me in my retirement than to see my people ruled by so worthy a successor to my throne. The king's offer to bestow his only daughter in marriage, and with her his kingdom, on the Princess Badour put her into unexpected perplexity. She thought it would not become a princess of her rank to undeceive the king, and to own that she was not Prince Kumir al-Zaman, whose part she had hitherto acted so well. She was also afraid to decline the honor he offered her, lest, being so much bent upon the conclusion of the marriage, his kindness might turn to aversion, and he might attempt something even against her life. These considerations, added to the prospect of obtaining a kingdom for the prince her husband in case she found him again, determined her to accept the proposal of King Armanos and marry his daughter. After having stood silent for some minutes, she, with blushes which the king took for a sign of modesty, answered, I am infinitely obliged to your majesty for your good opinion of me, for the honor you do me, and the great favor you offer, which I cannot pretend to marry, and dare not refuse. But, continued she, I cannot accept this great alliance on any other condition than that your majesty will assist me with your counsels, and that I do nothing without having first obtained your approbation. The marriage treaty being thus concluded, the ceremony was put off till the next day. In the meantime, Princess Badoura gave notice to her officers, who still took her for their prince, of what she was about to do, that they might not be surprised, assuring them the Princess Badoura consented. She talked also to her women, and charged them to continue to keep the secret she had entrusted to them. The king of the Isle of Arabian, rejoicing that he had found a son-in-law so much to his satisfaction, next morning summoned his council, and acquainted them with his design of marrying his daughter to Prince Kumir al-Zaman, whom he introduced to them, and told them he resigned the crown to him, and required them to acknowledge him for their king, and swear fealty to him. Having said this, he descended from his throne, and the Princess Badoura, by his order, ascended it. As soon as the council broke up, the new king was proclaimed through the city. Rejoicings were appointed for several days, and couriers dispatched over all the kingdom to see the same ceremonies observed with the usual demonstrations of joy. At night there were extraordinary feastings at the palace, and the Princess Hayat-al-Nefis was conducted to the Princess Badoura, whom everybody took for a man, dressed like a royal bride. The wedding was solemnized with the utmost splendor. They were left together and retired to bed. In the morning, while the Princess Badoura went to receive the compliments of the nobility in the hall of audience, where they congratulated her on her marriage and accession to the throne, King Armanos and his queen went to the apartment of their daughter to inquire after her health. Instead of answering, she held down her head, and by her looks they saw plainly enough that she was disappointed. King Armanos, to comfort the Princess Hayat-al-Nefis, bade her not be troubled. Prince Kumir al-Zaman, said he, when he landed here, might think only of going to his father's court, though we have engaged him to stay by arguments with which he ought to be well satisfied. Yet it is probable he grieves at being so suddenly deprived of the hopes of seeing either his father or any of his family. He must wait till those first emotions of filial love are over. He will then conduct himself towards you as a good husband ought to do. The Princess Badoura, under the name and character of Kumir al-Zaman, the king of Arabian, spent the whole day in receiving the compliments of the courtiers and the nobility of the kingdom who were in and about the city, and in reviewing the regular troops of her household, and entered on the administration of affairs with so much dignity and judgment that she gained the general applause of all who were witnesses of her conduct. It was evening before she returned to Queen Hayat-al-Nefis's apartment, and she perceived by the reception she gave her that the bride was not at all pleased with the preceding night. She endeavored to dissipate her grief by a long conversation, in which she employed all the wit she had, and she possessed a good share. To persuade her, she left her entirely. She then gave her time to go to bed, and while she was undressing, she went to her devotions. Her prayers were so long that Queen Hayat-al-Nefis was asleep before they were ended. She then left off and lay down softly by the new queen, without waking her, and was as much afflicted at being forced to act a part which did not belong to her, as in the loss of her dear Kumir al-Zaman, for whom she ceased not to sigh. She rose as soon as it was day, before Hayat-al-Nefis was awake, and being dressed in her royal robes as king, went to council. King Armanos, as he had done the day before, came early to visit the queen his daughter, whom he found in tears. He wanted nothing more to be informed of the cause of her trouble, provoked at the contempt, as he thought, put upon his daughter, of which he could not imagine the reason. Daughter, said he, have patience for another night. I raised your husband to the throne, and can pull him down again, and drive him thence with shame, unless he shows you proper regard. His treatment of you has provoked me so much I cannot tell to what my resentment may transport me. The affront is as great to me as to you. It was late again before the Princess Badoura came to Queen Hayat-al-Nefis. She talked to her as she had done the night before, and after the same manner went to her devotions, desiring the queen to go to bed. But Hayat-al-Nefis would not be so served. She held her back and obliged her to sit down. Tell me, I beseech you, said she, what can you dislike in a princess of my youth and beauty, who not only loves but adores you, and thinks herself the happiest of women in having so amiable a prince for her husband? Anybody but me would be not merely offended, but shocked by the slight, or rather the unpardonable affront you have put upon me, and abandon you to your evil destiny. However, though I did not love you so well as I do, yet out of pure good nature and humanity, which makes me pity the misfortunes of persons for whom I am less concerned, I cannot forbear telling you that the king my father is enraged against you for your behavior towards me, and tomorrow will make you feel the weight of his just anger, if you continue to neglect me as you have hitherto done. Do not therefore drive to despair a princess who, notwithstanding all your ill usage, cannot help loving you." This address embarrassed the Princess Badoura inexpressibly. She did not doubt the truth of what Hayat-al-Nefis had said. King Armanus's coldness to her the day before had given her but too much reason to see he was highly dissatisfied with her. The only way to justify her conduct was to communicate her sex to the Princess Hayat-al-Nefis, but though she had foreseen she should be under a necessity of making such a discovery to her, yet her uncertainty as to the manner in which she would receive it made her tremble. But considering that if Kumir al-Zaman was alive, he must necessarily touch at the Isle of Abin in his way to his father's kingdom, she ought to preserve herself for his sake, and that it was impossible to do this if she did not let the Princess Hayat-al-Nefis know who and what she was. She resolved to venture the experiment. The Princess Badoura stood as one who had been struck dumb, and Hayat-al-Nefis, being impatient to hear what she could say, was about to speak to her again, when she prevented her by these words: "Lovely and too charming Princess, I own I've been in the wrong, and I condemn myself for it, but I hope you will pardon me and keep the secret I'm going to reveal to you for my justification." She then opened her bosom and proceeded thus: "See, Princess, if a woman like yourself does not deserve to be forgiven, I believe you will be so generous, at least when you know my story and the afflicting circumstance that forced me to act the part I've done." The Princess Badoura, having discovered her sex to the Princess of the Isle of Abin, she again prayed her to keep the secret and to pretend to be satisfied with her as a husband till the Prince's arrival, which she hoped would be in a little time. "Princess," replied Hayat-al-Nefis, "your fortune is indeed strange, that a marriage so happy as yours should be shortened by so unaccountable an accident, after a passion so reciprocal and full of wonders. Pray heaven you may soon meet with your husband again, and assure yourself I will keep religiously the secret committed to me. It will be to me the greatest pleasure in the world to be the only person in the great kingdom of the Isle of Abin who knows what and who you are, while you go on governing the people as happily as you have begun. I only ask of you at present to be your friend." Then the two princesses tenderly embraced each other, and after 1,000 expressions of mutual friendship lay down to rest. The two princesses, having decided on a way to make believe that the marriage had been consummated, Queen Hayat-al-Nefis's women were deceived themselves next morning, and it deceived Armanus, his queen, and the whole court. From this time the Princess Badoura rose in the king's esteem and affection, governing the kingdom peaceably and prosperously. While things passed, as already mentioned, in the court of the Isle of Abin, Prince Kumir al-Zaman remained in the city of idolaters with the gardener, who had offered him his house for a retreat till the ship should sail to convey him away. End of section 25.